This is part 2 of chapter 2. We are talking about the First Amendment and the freedom of speech. And just as a matter of very quick review, we are learning when the government can or cannot punish speech under the First Amendment. And there are 2 ways the government can regulate speech, and that's to either regulate or punish the message itself, or number 2, to punish or regulate the conduct that's associated with the message. Thus far, we have only talked about the message itself, how the government can regulate what we say based solely on the message itself, the content of the message itself. And thus far, we have learned several different tests depending on the type of speech that is used. So for example, when it comes to offensive language, we've learned that the government can regulate that if that offensive language qualifies as fighting words. And there's a test for fighting words that we learned in order to determine if those fighting words can be regulated or punished. We learned about obscenity, pornography, and child pornography, and the Miller test that goes to determine obscenity or pornography. And that brings us to where we are today and where we're going to pick up. We have learned punishing the message, and these are the ways or the message themselves that can be regulated by the government. When we last left off, when we were talking about video recording the police. And we learned, yes, you can record the police. It's a First Amendment right, as long as you are not interfering with the officer. And that brings us to our next area of speech that is not protected. And that is threats. So threats are another form of unprotected speech. And why is it unprotected? Meaning, why doesn't the First Amendment protect that speech? And the reason is that there's no values in threat. There's no value in threatening somebody. So therefore, the First Amendment does not apply, and the government can regulate or prohibit or punish when we threaten somebody. It must be what we call a true threat. And that means that the statement is intended to be understood as a serious threat, as a serious intent to commit violence against the person. We learned when it comes to fighting words, and let's not confuse fighting words with threats. Remember, fighting words are so offensive, it wants to bring somebody to violence, a reasonable person, but threats are the threat of violence. And with fighting words, we learned that police, there's a higher standard for them. But when it comes to threats, it's not a higher standard for police. So threatening a police officer, it's not more difficult for the government to prosecute that than if it was threatening a citizen. Whereas using fighting words against a citizen or against a police officer, it's more difficult for the government to punish that because police have a higher standard. That is not the case with threats. Threats can come in different forms, so we must look at the context of the threat. So let's take a look at this. Here we have the burning of a cross, and for argument's sake, let's say that this is taking place in a public park. Is that a threat? And in general, and I'm not saying it never could be, but in general, this would not be considered a threat. Although it's offensive and disgusting, it would not be considered a threat because it's not threatening anybody in particular in violence. However, let's take a burning cross and put it on someone's front yard, someone of color. This burning cross is put on a person of color's front yard. That would be considered a threat, because let's look at the context of it. What does the cross stand for? And the hatred for people of color and the violence that often comes along with burning a cross and the groups that are associated with burning a cross, and putting it on somebody's lawn would be considered a threat as opposed to burning it in a public place, where that would just be an expression of hate speech, which we're going to learn about in a little bit. That would just be an expression of hate speech, which is protected by the First Amendment. But on the left, where it is burning on someone's front yard, that would be considered a threat. So you see where context is everything. Burning cross, burning cross. One's a threat, one is not. And why is that? Because of the context of where these crosses are being burned. Now that brings us to incitement to illegal action. And incitement to illegal action is unprotected speech. And why is that? Because it has no value. Inciting somebody to commit a crime has no value. Therefore, it is not protected under the First Amendment. But if the government wants to regulate incitement to illegal action, there is a test that goes along with that. And we call that the Brandenburg test. So in order for someone to be guilty of incitement to illegal action, you must look at the Brandenburg test. And step number one is they must direct someone to commit imminent lawless action. And step number two, that is likely to result in such action. So it's more than trying to incite somebody to commit a crime, to be incitement to illegal action. The result has to be likely, that it's likely that person will commit that lawless action because of the incitement. And an example of that, this is, if you remember back a few years ago, where Michael Brown was in Ferguson. He was shot and killed by the police. That was later determined by every agency that investigated it, local, state, federal agencies twice, determined that it was a justified shooting. However, after the shooting, immediately after the shooting, there were riots. And during this protest, this gentleman in the white and green shirt, he is Michael Brown's stepfather. And this is what he had to say.
Has urged protesters to burn this bitch down after the grand jury announcement.
So he is saying, burn this bitch down. And that was after the grand jury had refused to indict and charge the police officers. And so there was a rally, and at this rally, Michael Brown's stepfather was shouting, burn this bitch down. As a result of that, they did exactly what he said, was they started burning businesses down. So he could have been, and I don't know if he was or not, but he could have been charged with incitement to illegal action because that passes the Brandenburg test. Did he direct someone to commit imminent lawless action? Yeah. He was telling the crowd to burn this bitch down. And was it likely to result in such action? In that situation, yes. And why? Well, because the crowd was already agitated. The crowd was already emotional, and he played on those emotions. So in that situation, it was likely to result in imminent lawless action. Therefore, he could have been charged with incitement to illegal action. It passed the Brandenburg test. So up until this point, we've been talking about unprotected speech. But let's take a look at protected speech. And one form of protected speech is hate speech. And this may go contrary to what people believe. Because hate speech is really disgusting. It's speech that refers to or denigrates, belittles, or expresses contempt and hate towards others because of their race, their color, sexual orientation, etc. So off the top of your head, you may say, boy, why is that protected speech? How can it be protected for someone to say such hate speech? And it is protected speech. Some think it should not be, but we can never forget that our First Amendment is designed to protect such speech, no matter how offensive we may find it. Because we don't want the government to tell us what we should believe or not. We don't want the government to force us to believe something that we don't want to believe. Whether that belief is hateful, such as hating somebody because of their race or their color. And the First Amendment allows us to express that hate because we're conveying a message, no matter how much we disagree with that message. Hate speech becomes a problem if it is directed at somebody. So if it's not directed at somebody, if it's just a speech and expressing one's opinion, then it's protected. But when you direct it at somebody, then it may become fighting words. Because if you remember fighting words, it has to be directed at somebody and so offensive that it would bring somebody to violence, a reasonable person to violence. So hate speech, as long as it's not directed at somebody and it's face-to-face, then it is protected speech, meaning the government cannot regulate it and the government cannot punish somebody for using such hate speech. An example of this is this organization called the Westboro Baptist Church. I don't know if you've heard of this organization or not, but there was a famous Supreme Court case that involved the Westboro Baptist Church. And West Baptist Church is this quote unquote Christian church that protests at soldiers' funerals. And they protest that they're glad the soldiers died. As you can see there, thank God for dead soldiers, because that's God's way of punishing the United States for condoning homosexuality. Now, the average person, that is absolutely ridiculous. It's very offensive, but it's their belief. And they are entitled to their belief, and they are entitled to express their belief. And that's what they do. And not only do they express their belief, they go to funerals of soldiers, and they demonstrate outside of the funeral with banners like this that say, "Thank God for dead soldiers." Planes crash, God laughs. Fags doom nation, God hates fags. So they're doing this outside of soldiers' funerals. And the Supreme Court said they can do that. Even though it's very offensive, they are not directing it at anybody in particular. They're expressing their view, no matter how hateful and disgusting their view is. It is protected speech. Hate speech is protected. But the speech itself is protected, not the conduct. So hate motivated conduct is not protected. That's why we have hate crimes. So if you assault somebody, you are guilty of assault and battery. If you do it because of their race, the sexual orientation, the nationality, etc., now that becomes a hate crime. The government's not punishing your speech, they're punishing your conduct. And that's the difference between hate speech being punished and not punished, is we need to look at the conduct. So hate speech is protected speech, unlike the other forms of speech that we've gone over so far. And that brings us kind of to what we call the purgatory of free speech, and that's cruel and vulgar speech. And it's not fully protected under the First Amendment, but it's not fully unprotected either, like threats. It's kind of in that purgatory. It's kind of halfway. And what we mean by that is there are times when the government can regulate cruel and vulgar speech, and then there are other times when they cannot. And the reason it's not fully protected is it doesn't contribute to the free exchange of ideas guaranteed by the First Amendment. However, it's not so harmful that it should be totally unprotected, unlike threats. Threats do not contribute to the free exchange of ideas, but they are harmful, so they shouldn't be protected. But with crude and vulgar speech, it doesn't contribute to the free exchange of ideas, but it's not so harmful that it should be totally unprotected, meaning that the government can regulate it sometimes. So when can the government regulate crude and vulgar speech? If you are watching TV at 2 o'clock in the morning, you may see and hear things on TV that you wouldn't hear during the day when children can watch TV. And that's because the FCC, which is a government agency, regulates what can be on TV at certain times. And so the language you may hear at night on regular TV will certainly be more crude and vulgar than what is allowed during the day. And the reason being is that because children are not normally up late at night watching TV, so the FCC allows for crude and vulgar, at least more crude and vulgar language. But during the day, the FCC regulates it and prohibits it because children can be exposed to it. So it's protected speech if adult is using it. But it's unprotected if children are involved in some way. So certainly if a child is using it, then it can be regulated. Because don't forget, we have special protections when it comes to children. And courts have allowed the government to provide special protections through regulation to protect our children. And one is to prohibit children from using vulgar and obscene language. The other way it's unprotected is if children are likely to be listening to it. So even though an adult is using it, if children are going to be listening to it, then it can be regulated. But if it's purely adult using it, an adult audience, then the government cannot regulate it. And that's the difference when it comes to crude and vulgar language. Again, it's kind of that purgatory or in the middle type of protected / unprotected speech, because it goes both ways. So that's what we have for punishing the message. Remember, there's two ways. The government can punish the message, or they can punish the conduct associated with the message. So now we're going to shift gears, and we're going to look at punishing the conduct. When can the government punish the conduct that's associated with the message? And this gets broken down further into two different types. So generally, there's two types of speech that the government can regulate: the message itself and the conduct. We just did the message itself. Now we're going to look at conduct, and conduct is further broken down into two categories. The first is conduct that conveys a message, and the second is the location of the conduct. Each can be regulated, but in different ways, meaning different tests are used. And remember, I told you there are a lot of tests that you need to learn, and there's more coming. So conduct that conveys a message is when the government punishes the conduct that is conveying a message. Location of the conduct means the government can regulate the location, can regulate the action based on where that action is taking place, regardless of what the message is. So we're going to look at each of these individually. And the first one we'll look at is conduct that conveys a message. And we learned one already. We learned wearing of the armband in the Tinker case. That was conduct that conveyed a message, symbolic speech. Burning the flag. Why do you burn a flag? You're conveying a message. You're conveying a message against the government or the United States of America. Same thing with burning your draft card. In each of these situations, no words are spoken. However, the conduct is conveying the message. So when can the government regulate this conduct? If this conduct is conveying a message, when can they regulate it? And we use the O'Brien test to determine whether or not the government can regulate it. In short, I can tell you, if the government is regulating it just because of the message, if they're regulating that conduct just because of the message, they can't do that. They can regulate the conduct that's associated with the message, and if they want to do that, then it must pass the O'Brien test. So a law may prohibit conduct, even when the conduct is conveying a message, if the law passes the O'Brien test. And it's a two-part test. First, there must be a substantial government interest for the law. And then next, the government interest must be unrelated to the message that the conduct is expressing. So meaning viewpoint neutral. So the government's prohibiting this conduct, but then they're not doing it because of the message. They're doing it because they have another substantial government interest for doing it that has nothing to do with the message the person is conveying. And that's what this O'Brien two-part test is. And we call it the O'Brien test because it came from the O'Brien case. So in other words, the law must focus on the conduct, not the message. And why is the government prohibiting that conduct? If they're prohibiting it because they don't like the message, they can't do that. If they're prohibiting it because it's unrelated to the message and they have a substantial interest in doing it, then they can do it. So in O'Brien, and now we are reversing time again, we're going back in Vietnam and back to days before technology. And back in Vietnam, men of certain age would be issued a draft card. And that draft card is what the government used in organizing and conducting the draft being whether or not you go to war or not. So you needed your draft card, and the government needed you to have that draft card so that they could properly conduct the draft for the war, for a smooth and proper functioning of the draft system. So there was a law that prohibited destroying your draft card. And the purpose of the law was so that it would not interfere with the smooth and proper functioning of the draft system. So here we have a law that prohibited conduct. And that conduct is destroying your draft card. And why did they have that law? Because they didn't want destruction of the draft card to interfere with the smooth and proper functioning of the draft system. Well, a person named O'Brien did what many did back in the 60s, was he burned his draft card. And why did he do it? It was a symbolic demonstration, it was a symbolic speech as a protest against the Vietnam War. And he was charged with that crime that prohibited the destruction of the draft card. And O'Brien challenged it. He said, this law is unconstitutional. It violates my First Amendment right to freedom of speech because I'm conveying a message and the government is regulating that and they can't do that. And the Supreme Court ruled against him, and that's when they came up with this O'Brien test. So let's apply the O'Brien test to the facts of this case. So step number one is you need to determine, is there a substantial government interest in having the law? In this case, was there a substantial interest in the government having a law that prohibited destroying the draft card? The answer is yes. The smooth running of the draft system. That's why they had this law. So now you move on to step number two. Is the government interest unrelated to suppressing the message? What we call viewpoint neutral. So the reason the government had this law, did it have anything to do with suppressing the message that O'Brien was sending, which is protesting the war? And the answer is yes, it was unrelated. The law had nothing to do with his message. The law simply had to do with the need and necessity of running a smooth draft during a war. Keep in mind, there was a war going on. So the purpose of that law was to have a smooth running draft system. And it had nothing to do with the message O'Brien was trying to send. It was viewpoint neutral. Therefore, the court ruled that was a valid law. Let's take a look at another case. There's a law that prohibits the burning of the American flag because the government wanted to promote respect for the American flag. So we have a law, and what's the purpose of the law? They wanted to promote respect for the American flag. A person burned the American flag because he hates America. So he engaged in symbolic speech by burning the flag, sending the message that he hates America. So now let's apply the O'Brien test to see if this law is valid. Step number one, is there a substantial government interest in having the law? So with the burning of the draft card, the interest was a smooth running draft. in this law, the interest is to promote patriotism, basically, to promote respect for the flag. Is that a substantial government interest? And the answer to that is no. Remember, the government can't force its views on us. It can't force us to be patriots. So therefore, it fails step number one. There was no substantial government interest in having the law. Promoting respect for the flag is not a substantial government interest. Yeah, it's patriotic, but it's not a legitimate substantial government interest, such as the running of a smooth draft during the war. So therefore, the law is invalid. It fails step number one. You don't even have to go to step number two because it fails step number one. So there's no need to go to step number two. You only go to step two if the answer is yes to step one. So if you made the argument that yes, sorry, professor, that is a substantial government interest, is promoting respect for the flag. Okay, in your mind, it passes step number one. So now we go to step number two. Is it viewpoint neutral? Is the reason for the law, does it have nothing to do with why that person was burning the flag? The answer to that is no. That's the exact reason for the law. The purpose of the law was to suppress the message of anti-patriotism, anti-flag. So even if you found yes in step number one, it fails at step number two and therefore is invalid. So it only has to fail one of the two steps. In my opinion and the court's opinion, it fails both step number one and step number two. So I hope you understand that. If you have problems understanding the O'Brien test, please reach out to me so I can provide maybe another way for you to understand it. So let's take another one. The president passes a law that makes it a crime to kneel for the national anthem. So a little quiz here for you. Is this a valid law? Somewhat of a trick question. Is this a valid law? The president passes a law that makes it a crime to kneel for the national anthem. The answer to that is no, it is not a valid law. It's not valid because the president can't pass laws. The president is the executive branch, and if you remember, the executive branch can only enforce laws. Whose job is it to create laws? And that is Congress. So it was just a little bit of a trick question just to get your mind thinking. Hopefully you picked up on that when it said the president passes a law. Hopefully that rang some bells in you, some red flags. Something's not right there, and it's because the president can't pass laws. So let's take that out. And now Congress passes a law that makes it criminal to kneel for the national anthem. So Congress has the authority to pass a law. And they pass a law that makes it criminal to kneel for the national anthem, such as they are doing. So now if this law is passed, these guys that are kneeling during the national anthem are breaking this law. And the reason the government or the Congress passed this law was because they wanted everybody to show respect for veterans in the country. That's the reason. So is this a valid law? What do you think? Do you think this is a valid law? Well, let's go step by step with the O'Brien test. Is there a substantial government interest in passing the law? And the answer to that, hopefully you now understand, no. The government cannot force us to respect anything, veterans or the country or anything. So there's no substantial government interest. Therefore, this law would be invalid. And if you think the answer to step number one is yes, that is a substantial government interest, it would fail at step number two because it's not viewpoint neutral. Because the very reason for the law is to show respect for veterans in the country is exactly why they has to do exactly with the message that they're trying to convey by kneeling, by saying, we don't respect what is going on. Maybe not veterans, but we don't respect what's going on in this country. We think there's a lot of inequality in this country, so we're not standing for the national anthem. We're going to kneel. So it would fail on step number two as well. The O'Brien case, the reason for the law was for a smooth running draft, not to suppress the message at all. The other ones that we looked at, burning the flag, and this one, the purpose of the law was to suppress the message. And in addition to that, they are not considered substantial government interest. So that is suppressing the conduct that's associated with the message. That's suppressing conduct that is the message, and when the government can do it, and it's the O'Brien test. Now let's look at the second way the government can regulate conduct that's associated with a message, and that's the location of the conduct. So in this instance, we're going to look at where the conduct is taking place. The message, in this case, just like in the other, really is irrelevant. The message, the government cannot consider the message. All they can consider when regulating the conduct is where is that conduct taking place. So freedom of speech would be useless to poor people if they did not have the right to use public spaces to engage in free speech. And that's not just for poor people either, that's for anybody. So when the public, that is where we're designed to exercise our freedom of speech. So the government can regulate conduct based on where that conduct is taking place, such as the sidewalk, the streets, and the park. So depending on where in public is going to depend on what type of First Amendment protection there is. So a court will look at where in public the conduct is taking place to determine what, if any, First Amendment protection there is. The location is everything. Location, location, location. Not the message. The message is irrelevant. It's taken, it's already understood that whatever conduct they are conducting is expressing a message, but the government can't regulate it or stop it because of the message. They can only regulate it because of where it's taking place. And we call that the forum. So the court is going to look at the forum that the person is using. So the location is another word for forum. We're going to use forum from this point on. And there are two types of forums, classified into two categories: public forum, non-public forum. Depending on which forum the conduct is taking place in, will depend on what First Amendment protection it will receive. So again, location is everything. So the first thing we're going to look at public forums. What kind of First Amendment protection do we have in public forums? And what is a public forum? Streets, sidewalks, parks, municipal auditoriums, public meeting halls. I mean, this isn't an all-inclusive list. It's just a list of some of the types of public forums. And public forums receive maximum First Amendment protection. What that means is it's going to be difficult for the government to regulate our conduct if we're conveying a message, if it's in a public forum. But it's not absolute protection. Remember, no right is absolute. So the government can still regulate it. If you're in a public forum, the government can regulate your conduct. But there's, of course, a test that has to be used. So the use of a public forum cannot burden non-speech use of the forum. So public forums receive maximum protection. But example would be they cannot block a sidewalk, street, or interfere with the peace and quiet of others using the public forum. So if you want to have a parade down Main Street, the government can say, you can't have that parade at 5 o'clock in the afternoon during rush hour. That would just interfere with the street and traffic. So you see where the government can regulate it based on where it is. So when it's a public forum, the government can put what we call time, place, and manner restrictions on the use of that public forum. So this is the test we use to determine if the government can regulate that conduct in a public forum. It's called the time, place, and manner restrictions. Example, shouting in public after midnight. Why can the government regulate that? Well, it's a public forum, and that would interfere with the peace of others. As I just said, demonstrating in the street during rush hour, because of the time and the place, the government can regulate that and say, not during rush hour. Or noisy demonstration in front of a school during school hours, the time and the place, the government can regulate that and say, you can't have a noisy demonstration during school hours. You're going to interfere with the kids that are trying to learn. So when it comes to the public forum, we're going to look at time, place, and manner restrictions. And it's a 3-part test. And again, I apologize for all these tests that you have to learn. Don't shoot the messenger. This is just the way it is and the nature of the course. So when it's a public forum and the government wants to regulate it, we use the time, place, and manner restrictions, which is a 3-part test. So the government can use time, place, and manner restrictions on public forums when, 1, there's a significant government interest. So this is starting to sound similar to the O'Brien test. It's got a little different caveat to it, though. The reason for the restriction is viewpoint neutral. So in other words, we're not prohibiting you from marching down Main Street at 5 o'clock because we don't like the message that your parade is sending. We're prohibiting it because we need to have free-flowing traffic at that time. So the reason for the prohibition, the significant government interest, must be viewpoint neutral. Must have nothing to do with the message that the person is conveying. And the third, alternatives are available. Are there alternatives if the government says you cannot have a parade down Main Street at 5 o'clock? Yeah, there's a couple different alternatives. You can have a parade, on South Road. South Road is not busy at that time. There's an alternative. Or come back at 10 o'clock in the morning where traffic is light, and then you can have your parade then. So it's the three-part test. First, is there a significant government interest? And then why? Is it viewpoint neutral? It must always be viewpoint neutral. If they're ever doing it because they don't like the message, it's not going to be valid. So as an example, the government won't issue permits for parades during rush hour on Main Street. So let's apply the test. Is there a significant government interest? Yes, free flow of traffic. Is it viewpoint neutral? Does it have anything to do with the message of the parade? No. The reason is it's for free flow of traffic. Are there alternatives available? Yes. You can use it during the street during non-rush hour, or use another less busy street if you are, determined to have it at that hour. So a simple law like that, you see where we have to go through the 3 steps to determine if it's valid. Let's take a look at this one. The government won't issue permits to Nazis for parades during rush hour on Main Street. However, the Girl Scouts wanted to have a parade on Main Street during rush hour, and the government said, okay, you can do that. Did they violate the Nazis' freedom of speech? Let's go through the time, place, and manner test. Did they do it to advance a significant government interest? Again, the argument is yes, for the free flow of traffic. However, was it viewpoint neutral? No. And it's not viewpoint neutral because you allowed the Girl Scouts to do it, but you won't allow the Nazis organization to do it. So presumably you did it because the government did it because they disagree with the message that the Nazi organization wanted to convey during the parade. If it was purely viewpoint neutral, then they would have said either yes to the Nazis and the Girl Scouts, or they would have said no to the Nazis and the Girl Scouts. That would have shown that we don't care what your message is, you can't have a parade during that time. Well, if the significant government interest is the free flow of traffic, what difference does it make what the message is? It's going to impede traffic. So clearly here, the government is preventing the Nazis from having a parade because of their message. Therefore, it's not viewpoint neutral. Therefore, it fails the time, place, and manner restrictions. And you don't have to go to step 3 because you got your no there. But if you did go to step 3, it's irrelevant. But yeah, they can have a street during non-rush hour or use a less busy street. But it still fails because it's not viewpoint neutral. What you do for one group, you have to do for another group. Otherwise, on the surface, you're saying we agree with this message, but we disagree with that message. And we can't have a government do that. Let's take a look at another one. A law prohibits yelling and screaming after 2 a.m. on a public street. The test is, does it advance a significant government interest? Step number 1, yes. What's the government interest? Peace and quiet for everybody. Is it viewpoint neutral? Does the law tell you what you can or cannot say? No, it's just saying you can't scream at all after 2 o'clock. So it is viewpoint neutral. It's not prohibiting what you say, but how, the conduct you say it. Alternatives available? Yes. Yell and scream before 2 a.m. So this law would be valid. This law that's prohibiting the conduct, which is the screaming, how they're doing it is valid because it passes the 3-part test. Now let's get a little more difficult. A law prohibits yelling and screaming after 2 a.m. on public street. The person yells, "The mayor of this city is a crook." The person is arrested by a police officer because it is offensive to criticize the mayor. So step number 1, does it advance a significant government interest? We already said yes. You cannot yell after 2 a.m. because it disturbs the peace and quiet for everyone. Is it viewpoint neutral? Here's where it gets a little more tricky. On the surface, the law is viewpoint neutral. It's prohibiting screaming after 2 a.m. However, the way it's applied is not neutral. So there's 2 ways a law can be deemed unconstitutional. It could be unconstitutional the way it's written, but it can also be unconstitutional the way the police apply the law. So it's the same exact law as the first example, but the police officer himself or herself arrested this person because they didn't like what he was saying about the mayor. So although the law itself is viewpoint neutral, the way the police officer applied the law is not viewpoint neutral. Therefore, the police officer violated that person's First Amendment rights by arresting them. So this doesn't matter because it fails in step 2. So I hope you can see that there is a difference. You know, we have to look at it 2 ways. Law itself, the way it's written, is that constitutional? Does the law itself violate somebody's First Amendment rights? And then we also have to look at how are the government officials applying that law? Are they applying it? And in this case, the officer applied it so that it violated that person's constitutional right to freedom of speech because he didn't like what he was saying. So that brings us to the bonus question. And there's a bonus question that is posted that you are more than free to go ahead and answer. Google Cranston, Rhode Island, and the law on panhandling. And it's a few years old now, but Cranston was having a problem in a certain area of the city with panhandlers. And I believe Fall River also. If you want to use Fall River, that is fine too. Both Fall River and Cranston passed laws to prevent panhandling on certain streets. That law was challenged, saying it's unconstitutional. I want you to look up the Cranston, Rhode Island law or the Fall River law, whichever one you want, and apply the time, place, and manner test to determine if the law is valid. And that is worth up to 15 bonus points. So next, let's get into non-public forums. We just learned about public forums and the time, place, and manner test that the government must use. Now let's look at a non-public forum. And what the heck is a non-public forum? It's government property that is used to conduct official government business. So can you think of some government property that the purpose for that property is to conduct official government business? Examples would be post office, a courthouse, a municipal or state airport. Again, this is not an all-inclusive list, just some of the non-public forums. And the non-public forums, because the purpose of these forums is not for free speech. The purpose is to conduct government business. And because of that, it's not as protected as public forums, meaning it's going to be easier for the government to restrict your conduct on a non-public forum than it is a public forum, because public forums are designed for First Amendment use. Non-public forums are not designed for that. They're designed for other ways. So it's going to be easier for the government to prohibit that. So it's easier for the government to regulate speech on a non-public forum. So the government has more control over speech in a non-public forum because unlike public forums, these forums were not designed for speech, but for government business. So there is a test for this. And number one, the restriction must be reasonable. And number two, it must be viewpoint neutral. Now, if you've noticed something in common with these restrictions or these tests when it comes to conduct, is that they all must be viewpoint neutral. That the government cannot prohibit your conduct solely because of your viewpoint. So let's break these down a little bit. Reasonable, if the restriction is designed to prohibit speech because the speech, in other words, the conduct, would disrupt the normal activity of the non-public forum. That makes it reasonable. Hey, you know what you're doing? You can't do it here because you're interfering with the business of the airport or the business of the courthouse. And again, viewpoint neutral, meaning the restriction must be for everyone and not just for some or one group. So it cannot be, we're not going to let you exercise your conduct, convey your message through your conduct because we don't like what you're saying. They can't do that. They can do it if your conduct is going to disrupt the normal activity of the non-public forum. So example, the post office allows for Democrats to hand out flyers, but bans Republicans from doing so. Is this valid? Step number one, is it reasonable? Well, why are they banning Republicans from doing it? Well, they may say we're doing it because it interferes with the business at the post office. Well, if that's the case, then why are you allowing Democrats to do it? So that makes it not viewpoint neutral because they're allowing Democrats to do it, but not Republicans. So therefore, the government is saying it's okay, the Democrats, what they have to say, that's okay, but it's not okay for what the Republicans have to say. And the government cannot do that, even if it's a Democrat president or the roles were reversed and they allowed the Republicans to do it, but not the Democrats, even if it's a Republican president. You can't do that. That is the government not being viewpoint neutral, and it must always be viewpoint neutral. It would be valid if it banned everyone. So if the post office said, we're not going to allow anybody, Democrat, Republican, Independent, we're not going to allow anybody to hand out a flyer at the post office because that's too disruptive for our business. It's causing a problem in the post office and it's delaying people and you're just interfering with the business of the post office. Then that would be valid because it's reasonable, because it's interfering with the business, and it's viewpoint neutral because it's banning everybody from doing it. And then finally, let's look at a chart. I am a very visual learner, so I like to use charts because I think it helps. At least it helps me. And when it comes to regulating the conduct under free speech, this chart should help you. So here we have the overall topic of free speech and when the government can regulate conduct that's associated with free speech. If they are going to regulate the conduct because of the message, if they're going to regulate conduct that conveys a message, that symbolic speech, if that conduct is conveying a message, if the government is going to regulate that, we use the O'Brien test. And step number one, it must be a substantial government interest, and it must be unrelated to suppressing the message. In other words, viewpoint neutral. So they are regulating the conduct that's conveying a message, but they're not doing it because of the message. They're doing it because there's a substantial government interest. Now, if it's the location of the conduct, if the government is going to regulate your conduct because of the location, that is further broken down. If it's a public forum, sidewalk, park, street, then we use time, place, and manner restrictions. First step, is there substantial government interest? Is it viewpoint neutral? And are there alternatives available? If it's a non-public forum, like a post office or a municipal courthouse or any courthouse or a government airport, if it's a non-public forum, if the government is going to regulate that conduct based on that location, it just has to be reasonable and it has to be viewpoint neutral. It has to apply to everybody. Now, I know this is a lot thrown at you. There's a lot of tests here that you're going to have to apply on an exam. And if you found this confusing and you need further clarification on any of this material, please do not hesitate to contact me. I am more than willing to help. I've already had a couple Zoom meetings with other students who had needed just a little bit more just to get over the hump of understanding material. So I'm more than willing to do that. Please just reach out to me, and if I can help in any way, please let me know.